Since the early days of the Church, bishops have played an important role as leaders of Christians. As Christianity spread westward from the land of Judea into the Roman Empire, these bishops were appointed and installed to lead congregations of believers in their respective towns, administering baptism, communion, and shepherding believers in the face of persecution, Greek philosophy, and Roman oppression. As the church grew in numbers, naturally the bishops in some larger, more prominent cities began to exert greater influence over the church at large. Initially, the bishops of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch were the most prominent, with those in Constantinople and Jerusalem also gaining prestige moving into the 4th and 5th centuries. Eventually, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire around 476 AD, the Bishop of Rome, who Catholics refer to as the Pope, would ascend to great power both in matters of the church and the state. For several centuries through the Middle Ages, the Pope would rule with almost unrivaled authority in Europe, not over just spiritual matters, but also those of politics as well. What events took place to make this possible? And how is it that a church bishop could arise to such a position? And why doesn't the Pope hold such a powerful position today? This short presentation will take a brief look at the main events which led to the rise of the papal office and also its decline during the late Middle Ages. Although Christianity began as a fledgling religion which endured persecution and marginalization from Roman authorities through its first few centuries of existence, it quickly became popular within the empire due to the conversion of Constantine, who had become emperor of Rome in the early 1st century and endorsed Christianity within its borders. Prior to Constantine's rule, the Roman Empire had endured difficult times due to civil wars, economic downturn, and instability in leadership. While Constantine's predecessor, Diocletian, brought some level of stability to the empire, he could only delay but not stop its ultimate demise. Barbaric tribes living outside of the empire began to invade, and in the year 410 AD, the Visigoths made their way to Rome and sacked the city. The Romans had to withdraw their troops from their borders to the city of Rome to help thwart the Visigoths, and this allowed these barbaric tribes to flood across the defenseless frontiers. The Huns had made their way close to Rome in the year 452, but the Bishop of Rome, Leo, came and spoke to the leader of the Huns, Attila, convincing him to turn his troops back. Later, in the year 455, Rome was attacked again, this time by the Vandals, and the emperor was killed. Again, it was Bishop Leo who spoke to the king of the Vandals and convinced him to spare the city. So it was the bishop, not the emperor, who spared the city, and the people knew it. After the end of the empire in 476, Europe was in crisis. Plague, war, famine, and poverty were widespread, and no central government existed to help alleviate it. Such responsibilities were taken up by the church, who began to administer food supplies, administer a welfare program for those in need, and begin the construction of infrastructure around the now fallen empire. The church became the largest landowners in Europe and worked to collect taxes from the people. Under the administration of popes such as Gregory the Great, who held office from 590 to 604, the church became integral not only in the religious life of people, but also in their political life as well. As the church cultivated an exalted position within society in Europe, the office of the Pope as head of the church became a coveted and powerful position. The appointment of new popes became an increasingly competitive event, which led to division and the threat of instability. For example, in the year 799, Pope Leo III was kidnapped by supporters of the previous pope. Although he escaped, Leo realized his need for protection. A souring relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire due to political and theological differences caused the Pope to instead turn to the Franks, a powerful Germanic peoples ruled by the mayor of the palace. About 50 years prior to Leo's kidnapping, Mayor of the Palace Pepin the Short had assisted Pope Stephen II in driving the invading Lombards out of the Italian peninsula. Now, Leo turned to Pepin's son, Charlemagne, for help and crowned him emperor in the year 800. For centuries, the Pope and the Emperor would both rule over the lives of Europeans, oftentimes bidding for power over one another. For a time, especially through the 10th and 11th centuries, the Pope's power was held in check as it fell under the power of the feudal nobility. But later, the Church would undergo reform in order to free itself from lay investiture. The Church would bend the wills of rulers, lords, and kings, and under Pope Gregory VII in the late 11th century, it would prohibit lay interference in church affairs under the threat of excommunication. Gregory declared that spiritual powers were supreme over temporal powers, an idea that would last for centuries. Succeeding popes would continue to expand the powers of the papal office, leading to unchecked authority as well as unchecked immorality. Through the centuries, spanning from 1000 to 1300, successive popes continued to wield the highest level of political power in Europe. Of course, such high authority can also lead to a breakdown in morality, humility, and altruism. Pope Innocent III in the early 13th century used interdict, or the temporary excommunication of entire nations, over 80 times to coerce rulers to do whatever he desired. He also called for the Fourth Crusade, which eventually led to the siege of Constantinople, the largest predominantly Christian city in the world at the time. Later, Pope Boniface VIII would declare it necessary for every human being to be subject to the Pope, and he used his position to make both himself and his family wealthy. Although the Pope was to remain celibate, many popes fathered children and had several mistresses. By declaring forgiveness of sins to those who would tithe generously, the Church became extraordinarily rich, and vacancies for positions as bishops were at times sold to the highest bidder, a practice known as simony. Popes were often chosen by means of nepotism in politics, and in several points in history, multiple men claimed to be the true pope at the same time, leading to division and political quarreling. Along with all of these practices, the anti-papal advocates of the 13th and 14th centuries, such as Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, eroded the public's confidence and admiration for the papal office. This would begin to set the stage for the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. As the Pope's public influence declined, so did the Pope's political power due to secular rulers' disregard for pontifical command. In the late 13th century, Pope Boniface VIII came into conflict with Philip the Fair of France and Edward I of England over their decision to tax clergy within their domains to finance war. Although Boniface objected, he later allowed it after Philip refused to allow church collections in France to be exported to the Vatican. Although it was an isolated victory for royalty, it did begin to set a precedent for how royals would interact with the Pope moving forward. The vision of Europe as a unified land under Christianity, led by the Pope, was slowly evolving. During the Protestant Reformation, kings, dukes, and nobility began to identify themselves more regionally as they decided whether to remain Catholic or become Protestant. King Henry VIII of England himself denounced papal rule over religious affairs in his nation after Pope Clement VII refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. With loyalty to the Pope waning as the Protestant Reformation continued to spread, the separation of Europe into regional nations also became more apparent, especially after the 30 Years' War, which took place from 1618 to 1648. No longer would the Pope hold political preeminence over Europe, and no longer did kings and rulers allow the Pope to become so influential in political affairs.